Now, I told you how just because you have a monopoly in a technical sense that there is only one company, that doesn't mean that it has monopoly power. Well, likewise, just because you have multiple firms, that doesn't mean that the market is perfectly competitive or even competitive at all. And so now we're going to add a little more nuance to our model by talking about those situations which exist somewhere in between. Because we have this whole spectrum of market power. At one extreme, you have perfect competition. Everyone's a price taker. If you don't offer a lower price than your rival, you get run out of business. And then you have the other extreme with monopolies and monopsonies. One person has all the power. Well, what about those cases in between? Now, like I said, some industries like global commodities are very competitive. Some other industries, actually many industries, particularly in manufacturing, especially consumer manufacturing, are going to be either duopolies or oligopolies. Now, the word poly, that means number. So, like monopoly, one number, duopoly, two number, oligopoly, several number. It's the same root word as oligarchy for, several rulers, just like monarchy is one ruler. in in I'd say that in traditional social media, Twitter and Facebook, they're a duopoly. Microsoft and Apple are a duopoly in um, operating systems. There's other competitors, but it's mostly just the two. And lots of businesses are oligopolies. So your automobile industry is oligopolistic. You've got Ford, you've got GM, you've got Chevrolet, you've got Toyota, you've got Kia, you've got Volkswagen, right? There's quite a few choices of brand, but at the end of the day, it's still, you could still list them all. And in the real world, firms often follow something like a Pareto distribution. That if you don't know what the Pareto rule is, that's the 80-20 rule of business. 80% of your sales come from 20% of your customers. This appears in a lot of different places in nature. 80% of the land is owned by 20% of the people. 80% of effects come from 20% of like causes. Here, your 80-20 rule would be, 80% of the market is served by 20% of the firms. And the 80-20 rule, it's not like a hard and fast thing. It varies around a bit. In one industry, it might be more like a 70-30 rule. In another one, it might be more like 90-10. But the general principle of it is true that as a rule, you have a few very large firms that run the show. The industry is largely driven by their competition with each other. And then you've got a bunch of smaller firms that compete locally. They have some very specific niche they fill. They might have some local geographical advantage. Like we're able to ship to local companies cheaper because we're close by, but they're not competing on a global stage. And when you're talking about an oligopoly, the model gets a lot more complicated because they they don't have as much freedom. You could say that it looks like a monopoly. Often we call this monopolistic competition. Like a monopoly, they're able to set a price, but demand for their specific product is highly elastic. So you can get different prices for different brands for different product lines, but there's a lot of strategic thinking involved where they have so few rivals that they have to plan based around how they expect their rivals to respond. Now, there's always going to be an incentive for competitors to form a cartel and collude. This cartel meaning a collection of businesses that act like a monopoly, that all charge the same price, that work together as though they're one company. And this collusion can be an actual agreement, or it can be done tacitly through a sort of a nudge and a wink. Back in the day, that before there was competition law, I mean, back in the Gilded Age, governments actually actively promoted monopolies. You don't hear about that too much now, but it's true. There was this misunderstanding on the part of a lot of politicians. They believed that concentration of industry, because it could be more efficient, they thought it would actually be good for society, and so they promoted these big trusts. But that's what a trust was. It was a cartel that was formed by contract. Later on, we made that illegal in this country. You're not allowed to collude anymore. But people don't have to be able to communicate outright in order to do that. What they'll do is you as a producer might raise your price a little bit and see how your fellow competitors respond. In a competitive market, people want to undercut you. So if you raise your price, they're going to keep their prices lower so they get the business. If they raise their prices well, you know that they understand your intentions. And so even without directly speaking to each other, these companies can let their prices creep up to monopoly levels. And why would they want to do this? Well, because the monopoly generates higher profits, they could agree, again, either directly or through implication, they could agree to fix a certain quantity and price and then give everyone a quantity share that would make them richer. The monopoly is like a bigger pie, and so everyone gets a bigger slice. Even if your share of the market doesn't increase, you're still getting higher overall profits. But there are obstacles to forming cartels. See, if it was that easy, you would expect cartels to form in every industry, and there would be no competitive equilibrium. The problem is, firstly, you need to get everyone on board with the cartel. Everyone that's a threat at any rate, everyone that has meaningful market share. Because customers, right, consumers, all else being equal, they're going to go to the cheapest option. So if you form a cartel, say you have like 10 different competing companies. If you get 9 companies on board with the cartel, but even one of them refuses to participate, that sinks the whole plan, because consumers will just go to that 10th business that doesn't raise its prices. And if you get everyone on board, every member of the cartel has this temptation they face to cheat. Because you could, as a cartel member, lower your price by just a little bit less. And then you get the advantage of the monopoly price, but you also get to steal the whole market. People go to the lowest price, so they'll all switch to you. You would get the whole pie, but it would leave nothing for your fellow cartel members. And you might think of this as being like thieves killing each other over the loot. Bank robbers, you've pulled off a heist, you've managed to get out of there, you had a really intense car chase and shootout, and now it's time to divide up the sacks of cash. But everybody in the group, there's no honor among thieves. Every one of the bank thieves They could shoot the other thieves when their backs are turned and just take the whole thing. And if you know that a specific collaborator does this kind of thing, if you know that they have cheated their fellow cartel members in the past, or if you have good reason to believe that they're going to cheat you, then you wouldn't want to deal with them in the future. Because again, when they cheat you, you get nothing. So you're not willing to work with them. But the cartel is useless unless everyone's on board. And so the cartel is unsustainable. To keep the cartel alive, all of the players, all of the competitors in the industry would have to be patient enough to value their share of the future monopoly rents more than the gains from cheating. There's a trade off they all face. I could cheat and get more today from stealing the market once, or I could be patient, respect the cartel, and I only get a smaller share, but I get that smaller share over and over and over again. And it's possible for this to happen. But the more members you add to the cartel, the more likely it will be that one of them will want to cheat. One of them might be in dire financial straits, for example. And normally they wouldn't cheat, but if cheating is the only way to stay open, they'll do it. Or you could have something like a recession, which causes everyone to become desperate for the same reason. Collusion is really hard to keep going. Oligopolies can do it. They can do it because they're small enough. They have enough, or they have few enough competitors that they can kind of keep the pressure on each other and keep watching each other. And if one of them starts to do badly, they might even help bail them out just to make sure that the cartel doesn't break down. But if you have a lot of competitors, it's going to be really hard to police them all. Just like how coast bargaining breaks down as you add more people. And so this is why colluders in the past have typically preferred using laws or violence to enforce collusion. Labor unions are a type of cartel, right? An employee is essentially a producer of labor. And what does a labor union do? Well, it's a group of employees who all agree to bargain collectively, to act like they're one employee so that they can try to rig the market in their favor. They're a monopoly. They're a monopoly on the sale of labor to a specific business or a specific industry if the entire industry is unionized. Well, the effectiveness of a labor union usually depends directly on how well they're able to mobilize violence to enforce the union. There was a time in America when people take my fall and spring classes, I actually have a whole unit on this, but there was a time in America when it was common for employees and employers to have actual shooting wars. Uh, People that tried to join a union, employers would go in and hire thugs to beat them up, shoot them, just terrorize them. And the unions would fight back with essentially acts of terrorism. They'd go in and set bombs in coal mines. They'd shoot at factory guards. The only way that a union could really operate was if it threatened to hurt people that did not join the union. And even to this day, they'll still beat up so-called scabs. A scab is a worker who refuses to participate in strikes. They refuse to abide by the rules of the union. Yeah, my pa was a policeman up in Ohio, Rust Belt. And in those days, it wasn't the Rust Belt yet. The big auto manufacturers were still there. And they were always having these little riots where the auto plant would go on strike, and then the scabs would try to go to work. And you have what's called a picket line. All the union men they get together and they try to block the entrance to the factory, and they'd call out the police. Them being the factory owners, the companies. They call out the police because they knew that sooner or later one of the scabs was going to try to force their way through the picket line. And then the Union thugs would start to beat up the scab, and that's when Pa would step in, and he got to do his favorite part of the job, beating down the Union men. Carried a big flashlight with him, and they called him El Kabong, named after this cartoon character, this horse that ran around with guitar hitting people on the head. And the unions, they'd have to use pressure like that. Sometimes it'd just be social pressure, you know. If you go to work when there's a strike on, you're not going to be drinking with the guys after work. Your wife's not going to be invited over to social events, you know, church events anymore. But one way or another, they have to be able to coerce people into it. In a lot of countries, in America, you've got what's called the right to work. Nobody can force you to go on strike, but in a lot of countries, that's not true. They actually legally protect unions by making it illegal to not participate in a strike. If your union says that they're not working, then you are violating your contract with them if you don't join, and you are forced to be in the union as well. You also get these tacit cartels called interlocking directorates. So this one's a little different. In usually with tacit collusion, you have different companies that are kind of collaborating with each other secretly. With an interlocking directorate, what happens is the leadership of one company, one corporation, will also be the leadership of another one. So the companies are technically separate, but in practice, they're all unified because the boards of directors are the same. They might be different on paper, but the same people own and run both. So they act like one company because of that. And very often you'll find that smaller companies are owned by larger companies. So, for example, there are dozens of different soda brands, but in reality, there's only three main corporations: Coca-Cola, Sprite, Fanta, Mellow Yellow. All of that's owned by Coke. Pepsi, Star, Mountain Dew, Mug, all of that's owned by Pepsi. You've got an oligopoly in the soda industry. For each flavor, these three companies will have their own version of the flavor. And so even though it seems like there's a lot of competition, in reality, there's almost none at all. You get a similar thing with your news media, your television. Six companies own everything, just about. News Corp, Time Warner, Comcast, Disney, Viacom, and Sony. All these different brands are all just different branches of the same, they're different tentacles of the same octopus. In real life, industries are almost never perfectly competitive or monopolistic. But companies, they're going to try to do anything they can to make it less competitive. You understand? They don't want you as a producer don't want competition. Competition's good for society because it gets us to the competitive equilibrium. But competition is horrible for a producer. They can't jack the prices up as much. And one of the main ways they'll do this is through what's called product differentiation. So you remember how we define the good depends on how we choose to think about it. And so what a lot of producers will do is they will think of themselves in more narrow terms. They might have all kinds of different product lines, but they don't think of themselves as selling just one product. Instead, they'll sell many different varieties of it, and they try to make their products as different from one another as possible. With Coke and Pepsi, for example, what's the difference between them? Well, some people say that there isn't one, but there is. Pepsi's a lot sweeter than Coke. Companies will they'll sell to a specific kind of person. They'll offer specific features. And very often they'll kind of keep a distance from each other too. You tend to see, for example, that Apple, at least back in the day, Apple liked to market itself as computers for artists, cultured people, whereas Microsoft liked to sell itself as computers for working men. They're both selling computers. They're both in the computer industry, but by changing the focus of their business, they're able to make themselves kind of a sub industry in which there's less competition. And that allows them to charge more markup. And businesses can also exploit differences in benefits and costs to the consumer besides just price. So your homework will explore this in more detail, but the classic scenario involves spatial competition. Now, time spent shopping is a transaction cost. And so if you locate closer to customers than your competition does, you can charge a markup up to the value of the time they save. So you imagine your time is valuable to you. You'd be willing to pay a little more if it means you don't have to drive as far to go to the store. Well, that's one way that companies are going to make money. They're going to try to find ways to sell convenience to people. If they can't make their product different, like say two stores that are selling essentially the same goods, then they'll try to find some other advantage that allows them to offer a good, not necessarily cheaper in price, but cheaper in terms of the overall opportunity cost to the consumer. And this has tons of interesting implications for how people settle. So a common textbook scenario involves two stores settling next to each other. You have a city, and suppose the city has its population kind of uniformly spread out. So your two shops, they'd want to locate right next to each other in the middle of town. And everybody on one side of town will go to the shop that's slightly closer to them, and everybody on the other side of town will go to the shop that's slightly closer to them. And you can also get natural monopolies forming through a similar sort of logic. In this case, not because there's uh, necessarily a super high fixed cost, but I mean, a lot of stores can look like natural monopolies. You have a small town. There's only so much business in the town. You do have to keep the lights on. You do have to buy the building, buy the land. Businesses are going to space themselves out. you might notice there's a lot of gas stations in any given town, but usually the gas stations aren't right next to each other, are they? Or there's always a lot of stores in a town. It's not just Walmart, right? You have other grocery stores like Food Lion or Ingles, but they don't all locate right next to each other. A lot of these businesses run razor thin profit margins. And if they can save a customer just a little bit of time, or if they can appeal to the customer in some other way, like by selling a different type of product, different product lines. Walmart always specializes in the cheapest garbage. Ingles is classier. Then you can survive that way. And businesses can also be complements to each other too. So a consumer who's going shopping, if they can knock out more than one errand at once, that saves them time. And so there's a natural pressure. Although you tend to want to stay away from your direct competition, usually you want to locate near other businesses that you're not directly competing with. If you have a store, then it makes sense to open a restaurant near the store. If you have a store and a restaurant, it makes sense to open a bank near it, and so on and so forth. You're able to charge more markup because the consumer is saving time by going to a place that has many businesses instead of just a few. It saves driving time in between. And so markets and by extension towns are naturally going to form around places of meeting. The competitive pressure lends itself to the formation of, you know, settlements. And the natural shape of the settlement, absent barriers to travel and construction, like having really hilly ground or swampland, is going to be a circle. So, just like gravity shaping a celestial body, that everything is being pulled towards the center of mass, and so it spreads evenly out into a sphere. You expect that human settlement patterns will naturally sort themselves into circles, notwithstanding like some land that's unsuitable for building on, so you go around it. So your high value businesses, they're the ones that are able to afford the land. They're able to afford the property tax, to pay the rents, all of that, and they'll naturally congregate together in the center of cities. And then your lower value businesses spread out around them, fading into the countryside. They've got this planned city in Saudi Arabia, calling it the Wall. Saudi Arabia is going to build a city of 9 million people, and it's going to be essentially just two like giant buildings running parallel beside each other, and they'll have tram lines. And it is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard of, because in a city, your travel time between any 2 points, if it's a circle, that's the shape that minimizes the average travel time between any 2 points. A straight line maximizes the average travel time between any 2 points. It's just so dumb. But yeah, people's decisions of where they live, that is an economic decision as well. And so you get a kind of equilibrium settlement pattern across a landscape. And it looks like, circle-ish blobs popping up anywhere that you have terrain that's suitable to transportation. Usually rivers, often the junction of multiple rivers. Nowadays, new cities aren't as bound to water, and instead they tend to pop up more along things like interstates. Well, in conclusion, the default model of economics is perfect competition where everyone is a price taker. But other market structures do exist. Free markets with free entry have a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. We expect that the profitability of the industry goes down as more people move in to compete. And this incentivizes producers to either outcompete or cooperate with their competition. Now, one opposite extreme, we have monopolies, one producer, and monopsonies, one consumer. Both are going to redistribute wealth to themselves by rigging the price, raising it for the monopoly, lowering it for the monopsony. And they both destroy wealth by reducing the quantity traded. They're essentially doing the exact same thing that a government does with the price control. Under some circumstances, resource efficiency and incentive to innovate, network externalities, a monopoly can actually be a good thing. And the threat of entry can make monopolies less harmful or even unsustainable. But cartels will attempt to collude to act like monopoly, and cheating can destroy them from within. And producers resort to product differentiation and selling convenience to survive. Finally, in our last video series for this unit, we'll sum up just one last go over the all of our 10 policy and market failures. And then there will be a brief discussion of how politics incentivizes the creation of failures. I've given you a broad theory of how an economy should be run, how an economy can go off the rails and result in inefficient outcomes. We'll be looking at why these failures appear so much, despite economics having, more or less a consensus that they're bad. I apologize for the quality of this video recording. It felt a lot harder to do than my other ones. But I'll see you in the next one.